Welcome, everybody. I'm sorry we're starting a little late. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Iain McGilchrist, who I've known for 30-something years, I guess.
That long, I guess.
Could well be. We both trained together at the Maudsley Hospital in London, and that experience alone is enough to produce enduring memories, I would say.
Yes.
Anyway, our careers took rather different paths. I devoted myself to reductionist science. Iain has taken a rather different view of how we should understand the effects of brain on behavior, and has looked, as it were, outwards rather than inwards, looking at the consequences of what brains do for society, and specifically looking at an age-old problem of the impact of cerebral asymmetry on a whole series of functions, which he will be discussing, and I won't spoil what he's going to say, but I would like to say just two things. That type of expertise is rare. It requires an extraordinary grasp of an enormous literature. And the second thing it requires is an ability to write well. And both those things Iain has in abundance. And if I owe anything to Iain, it's the fact that he taught me to write. And I will for always treasure that as one of the greatest gifts that anyone has ever given me. But I'm very grateful to have you here today, Iain.
Thank you.
And I shall hand over to you now to give your talk.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you all very much for having me here to talk. The irony is that I am actually in UCLA, but we're talking in this way, but that sometimes life does things like that. So what I want to talk to you about today, as Jonathan said, is a topic that has become rather untouchable, the differences between the two brain hemispheres. Science and philosophy have an at times uneasy but nonetheless inescapable relationship. Some scientists seem to believe that they are innocent of philosophy, which simply means they've bought into whatever the current paradigm dictates without knowing it. And some philosophers seem to think that science can tell them nothing of importance, despite the advances of modern physics. But I believe with Alfred North Whitehead that the antagonism between science and philosophy has, as he put it, like all family quarrels, been disastrous. Science has much to contribute to philosophy, and philosophy to how we understand what it is that science reveals. Much of the practice of science involves the amassing of findings, but its goal has always been and must be to go further, to move beyond mere information to an understanding of the picture as a whole. As Erwin Schrödinger put it in a lecture in Cambridge in 1951, the purpose of science must ultimately lie in helping answer the profound question asked by Plotinus about 1800 years ago. But we, who are we? Pascal, that's interesting. I can't make my slides move. Is there a reason? Can I get rid of that, for example? Normally when you do that, that's going to be tricky. Apologies for the glitches. Pascal observed that the twofold nature of man is so evident that some have thought that we had two souls. And philosophers as diverse as Kant, Goethe, Schopenhauer, Bergson, and Max Scheler independently observed that there were two orders of reality, two different realms of experience. Close to the core of who we are, oh gosh, how do I go back? There we are. Close to the core of who we are has to be, of course, the brain. And today I want to talk to you about its divided nature. Nothing could be more obvious and yet less discussed than hemisphere difference. Impossible to deny, it has, with notable and important exceptions, simply been ignored, like the proverbial elephant in the room. What was once believed has been largely discredited and discarded, leading some to believe irrationally that there are no significant differences. But we have learnt and are learning a great deal more about the topic, and just because our first answer may have been misguided doesn't make the question less worth asking. Indeed, it won't go away. To quote from two distinguished practitioners in the field, Tim Crowe in Oxford, except in the light of lateralization, nothing in human psychology or psychiatry makes sense. And to quote from Ono Gunturkun, at Bochum, who is the winner of Germany's most prestigious science prize, the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize. Hemispheric asymmetries pervade practically all major neural systems of the human brain. There is hardly any perceptual, cognitive, or motor system that is not affected by the left-right differences of at least some of its components. There are three questions that won't go away. The first is, why is the brain divided at all? I mean, there is this mass that exists to make connections, and power is proportionate to the number of connections it can make, and yet evolution has preserved this divided nature, and it's very profound in the human brain. Only 2% of neurons cross in that corpus callosum in this rather wonderful picture from Vesalius in the 15th century. It's marked L in the middle of your picture. The second question is, why is it asymmetrical? This is a picture designed to show you what's called Lateralization talk, that the left hemisphere is broader and just slightly backwards in the left hemisphere, and that the frontal lobe of the right hemisphere is broader and juts forward. In fact, that is the biggest asymmetry in the brain, although it wasn't mentioned in my training at all. We focused entirely on what was called the language area in the left hemisphere, which can't be a language area because the great apes also have exactly this expansion, but no language. And I suppose the third question is, why is the corpus callosum, which is in fact a mammalian invention, over time getting smaller proportionately and more inhibitory? So here you see the corpus callosum of a dog on the left and its brain, and the corpus callosum of a human. And you can see that despite the enormous difference in brain size, there is not a proportionate difference in the corpus callosum. It's also interesting that there are more inhibitory neurons in apes than in any other animal, and that there are more inhibitory neurons in humans. It's estimated up to about 30% of all neurons are functionally inhibitory than in any other apes. So there are a number of problems here. And it's not just something that happens in humans. It looks as though something needs to be kept apart from something else, even if it's very important that they should be at some level integrated. Every creature with a recognizable brain has a divided brain. Even the neural networks of mollusks, spiders, insects, slugs, and worms express lateralized behavior. Here we've got our old friend C. elegans with only 302 neurons, and it expresses chemoreceptors with left-right differences. And the earliest neural network we know of, that of a sea anemone, Nematocella vectensis, 700 million years old, already shows signs of lateralization. The axis of the creature is from left to right here. What is this about? Well, as Ono Gunturkun mentions, if animals from nematodes to humans show asymmetries of brain and behavior, we should expect that left-right differences provide some important fitness benefits. What might they be? Well, in 2009, I published this book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, in which I tried to give some answers to that question. I recently published a more extensive book, which I hope to be able to just talk about briefly at the end of this discussion. But what I emphasized in this book is that the reason we'd got nowhere with hemisphere differences is that we treated the brain as though it were a machine, and we'd ask the machine question, what does it do? And we'd come up with, language and reason in the left hemisphere and pictures and emotion in the right hemisphere. And then it turned out that both hemispheres were equally involved, or at least to some extent involved in each of these in different ways. And it's the in different ways that matters. The differences are not in the what, they're in the how, as they would be in the differences between a living being rather than the differences between a machine. What underlies that difference in the how is the issue of attention. And when I first realized this very solid neurological, indisputable finding that there is quite different attention paid by the right and left hemisphere, the full import of it didn't immediately strike. But attention is how we understand the world, and the way in which we pay attention influences what, in fact, we find there. I'm showing you this picture of the common wall lizard because if, for example, you experiment with this creature and tape over its right eye, it will use its left eye to look out for a predator, and you can hang up a simulacrum of a predator and it will fix it with its left eye. If you tape over its left eye, it will still try to use the left eye to look at it. And this is because I believe the fundamental difference between the two hemispheres is that all living creatures have to solve a conundrum, which is how to eat and stay alive. Because the manipulation of the world to get and grab and to have, involves a targeted attention to a detail, very narrowly focused, very sharply focused, and already committed to its object. Whereas if it doesn't have the exact opposite kind of attention at the same time, i.e. broad, sustained, vigilant, uncommitted as to what it may find, it won't see a predator. It won't see its conspecifics. It won't see its mate, its offspring that it needs to be watching out for at the same time. And this is such a difficult thing to do, to pay these two kinds of attention to the world, that evolution has solved this problem, if you like, by giving all creatures neural networks that can be distinct enough to pay different kinds of attention at the same time. And if you look, as we think of it, down the evolutionary tree, you can find that fairly regularly and with much greater regularity as evolution advances, the left hemisphere is the one with which we focus on prey and target things narrowly, and the right hemisphere, the one in which we look out vigilantly for everything else that's going on in the world. So one is enormously comprehensive, the other extremely limited. But it has its uses, of course. Without it, we can't survive. So the difference in these kinds of attention is very well established in neuroscience by neurologists and psychologists. Equally, philosophers have no difficulty in understanding that the nature of attention changes what we find. The same thing, for example, a human body, attended to in quite different spirits in different contexts, will reveal quite different aspects of it. And all I really have done is to put together the indisputable finding of differences with attention and the indisputable finding that attention changes what you find, to show that each of these hemispheres potentially can give rise to a different experiential world. Now, this is a view of the mountain behind my house on the Isle of Skye. Its Norse name was Talisker, which means the sloping rock, i.e. the outline of this mountain. And you can tell from the fact that this was its name, that it was a landmark from the sea for Norsemen coming down there 1,000 years ago, because the bay is treacherous. We know that before that, long before that, 1,000 years before that, there were Picts who used the mountain for shelter and venerated it as perhaps the home of the gods. In the 18th century, people came here to paint its many-colored, many-textured form. In the 19th century, people were fascinated by the fact that it's an extraordinary example of columnar basalt formation. A speculator might therefore think of it as dollars. A physicist will tell you that 99.99% of it is empty space, and the other 0.01%, we don't really know what it is. Now, these are all perfectly real aspects of this mountain. Which one is the real mountain? Well, you might say, well, it's really just a lump of rock. But actually, that's already a very prejudiced, particular, perhaps important in some circumstances, but a very narrow way of thinking about it. It is all of these things, depending on how we attend to it. And the fact that these two worlds are given rise to by our two hemispheres all the time is not something we're aware of, because the meta-control center for this is in the midbrain, well below conscious functioning. And here you see an arrow pointing to the tectum of the midbrain. Some people think it is the tectum, others the tegmentum, but there's no dispute that this is the area in which this meta-control center, which millisecond by millisecond may prioritize which information goes to which hemisphere, or which hemisphere has overall control of the phenomena that are being perceived. This is where it goes on. And there is involved in this process a sort of hermeneutic circle. How you begin attending changes what it is you find. And what you find dictates what you will from now on tend to prioritize when you attend and the kind of attention you will pay. So very soon, starting from whichever way you like to think, whether you think of the world as a mechanism or you think of it as a holy creation, whatever it may be, you see a different world and you get a coherent world that builds up from the loop that you have started with your very first steps. Am I dichotomizing? Well, excuse me, nature has been at the business of dichotomizing long before I did. It's massively clear that these are two very distinct hemispheres, and each hemisphere is by at least a factor of 10 much more connected with itself than with its partner. And there are important white matter tracts. You can see here the superior longitudinal fasciculus, and there's also the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, the uncinate fasciculus, and so on, that link together dramatically very distinct parts of a hemisphere. And so two things happen which tend to unite effects in a hemisphere. One is that in any complex system, there are a number of ways in which things may go wrong, almost an infinite number of causes, but there are only a finite number of common pathways by which the deficit can manifest. An example is that anything from a fuel leak, a strike, a suicide, a driver turning up late, all very different, have the same effect that your train is late. And the other is that there is something that von Monikoff called diaskesis, which means that dysfunction in one part of a loosely connected system can have important effects at a relatively distant part of the same system. So what are the results of this different kinds of attending? I'm going to do something very quick and dirty, which pains me because I've been very meticulous and detailed in what I write. But for these purposes, I'm going to give you just some very quick and dirty headlines. What are the kinds of differences in the worlds that are brought to bear? Well, the first is that the left hemisphere prefers what it is that it already knows is there. And it's very much disconcerted when it's something new. The right hemisphere, as we know from a decade's work by Elkin and Goldberg, is processed by the right hemisphere. And once it's familiar and known and categorizable, it becomes the property, if you like, of the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere is on the lookout for the new. The left is looking for what is already familiar and known. It has to be quick in its action, so it's much better to make knee-jerk, ready reactions to grab it. And it may be wrong, but it's better for the left hemisphere to be that rather peremptory actor. This also means that the left hemisphere is more certain about things than the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is open to possibility. Ramachandran calls it the devil's advocate, because it's the one that is saying to the left hemisphere, you think it's one of those, but it might not be actually. And something like this famous duck rabbit that Wittgenstein made much of is comprehensible to the right hemisphere because it's able to hold in suspension two possible things that it's seeing here. Whereas the left hemisphere is, come on, this has got to be a rabbit, it's got to be a duck. What do you mean? It's a duck rabbit. The left hemisphere is more prone to fixity. If you imagine it as a predator, it's ultimately trying to fix, and in fact, animals can indeed immobilize their prey, literally. But one of the things it needs is that fixity in order to be able to capture, whereas the right hemisphere sees that actually nothing is ever static in the entire cosmos. Unlike Newton, who thought that the normal state was stasis and that motion had to be accounted for, we now know that motion is the norm, the universal norm, and that stasis, if it ever existed, would be the thing that would have to be accounted for. And this means that when the right hemisphere is damaged, you can get a sort of stop-go animation, a bit like an old Juddering cine film called echinotopsia or palinopsia, in which you see a series of images, static images composing motion. Another difference is that the left hemisphere is interested in the parts and the right in the whole. This is quite literal in the case of the body. The left hemisphere understands a nose, a thumb, a leg. The right hemisphere alone has the body image, which is not just, of course, a visual image, but an image in all modalities of the whole body. But in general, the right hemisphere sees that all things are to be understood, have to be seen in the context of the whole, whereas the left hemisphere's raison d'etre is to take things apart and seize on a detail. So there is something called the hierarchy of attention, which dictates that when you look at something, the first thing you take in is the whole, not the parts. So most people see an H and a 4 here before they see the E's and the 8s. There is an exception to this, which is in schizophrenia, which is interesting because schizophrenia mimics many right hemisphere dysfunctional states. If you did see the E's and the 8s before the H and the 4, don't worry. I have a professional obligation to point out that this can happen for other reasons. And it's this picture, which if you've never seen it before, may puzzle you because it just looks like a lot of dots and splashes, but it is in fact a picture of a Dalmatian dog sniffing the ground in the way under the shade of a tree where two pathways cross. If I were in a lecture theatre, I could point to that with a laser, but you'll have to find it for yourselves. And these are just some drawings done by patients with temporary parietal right hemisphere lesions. On the left, you see a human being. In the middle, you see a bicycle, which has certainly got two wheels and some pedals, but the relative sizes of the wheels and the pedals and their relationship in space is completely wrong. And on the right, you see a house, which is something that's got one of those pointy things called a roof on it, but the whole form of the house has gone. These obviously demonstrate something else that will be well known to most of you, the phenomenon of hemi-neglect, which is much more pronounced and much more common after right hemisphere damage than after left. And the first three were done by patients of mine. The first is an attempt to draw a picture of me, the second of a flower, the third of a clock, and the fourth was, I can't trace it, but I did find it on the internet, obviously a drawing of a girl's face. This comes from a cartoon, an animation done by the Royal Society of Arts about my work, which really just shows that the neglect when the right hemisphere is damaged can be so extreme that people will disown the right half of the body, disown the left half of the body, and the whole existence may be denied, but they may cease to shave and they may cease to dress on that side. Another difference is between the explicit and the implicit. This may not sound terrifically important, but is, because in fact all the most important things that happen to us are not well served by language. Things like love, things like a sense of the sacred, things like our understanding of music or art. And of course, poetry demands that we use implicit language, not explicit language. We use metaphors, we use imagery. And this is a big distinction. The left hemisphere on its own tends to take jokes literally, doesn't understand what people mean by metaphors, whereas the right hemisphere is well equipped to understand irony and all these other things. Read the body and read the face in addition. The left hemisphere tends to abstract things from context, puts them in a category of things that are already familiar. It has then pigeonholed them, if you like. The right hemisphere sees that actually everything is understood only within a context, and that once you take it out of its context, it's completely changed. Another difference which follows from this somewhat is that the right hemisphere is better able to appreciate individuality, uniqueness, idiosyncrasy, whereas the left hemisphere is busy taking out abstractable things that are shared in common by a particular category that it has already to draw on. The right hemisphere is, for this reason, and many others, because it has much better connections with the emotional brain, with the subcortical areas, is more socially inclined, and this is from Velotigara's group, just I thought rather an amusing illustration that the left hemisphere sees, quote, social partner and food, whereas the right hemisphere sees that, it's Sarah and it's Mark. The left hemisphere prefers and is more interested in the size and amount and quantity of something, because after all, it's the one that grabs and gets, and the more we can grab and get, the better. The right hemisphere, being the devil's advocate, is the one that is looking out for quality differences and is able, as I say, to appreciate uniqueness. Interestingly, the left hemisphere seems to be more interested in the inanimate and tends to actually reduce things that are animate to inanimacy. So people with right hemisphere deficit sometimes compare themselves to a chest of drawers, or people to machines or zombies, whereas the opposite way round, when there's damage to the left hemisphere, people tend to see things that we wouldn't normally call animate as animate, that the sun is animate because you can see it moving in the sky and it gives us heat and so forth. Another important difference is the left hemisphere is ridiculously unrealistic. It's very optimistic about itself. An extreme illustration of this, which is not at all uncommon, and probably every medic has seen an example of this, is somebody who's had a right hemisphere stroke and therefore has a paralyzed limb, perhaps on the left side of the body, who will completely deny that the limb is in any way defective. When asked to move it, they say, there, I moved it, but nobody can see it move. And if you bring the limb, for example, an arm, right round in front of the patient and say, there, move that, they say, oh, that's not my arm, doctor, that's your arm, or that belongs to that patient over there. So there's a total denial of any problem. And some psychologists did interesting tests on people who had for 15 minutes one hemisphere at a time suppressed, and they gave each hemisphere a personality inventory to fill out about itself, and they gave the same inventory to family and friends. And when they compared them, they found that the left hemisphere had a remarkably polished and optimistic idea about its own strengths, and that the right hemisphere was a little bit on the underside, but was more effectively realistic. And finally, the least exciting but the most important distinction, the one that carries the greatest philosophical weight, is that between something as it is present without being categorized, verbalized, or otherwise conceptualized. This is better attended to and received by the right hemisphere. And once the left hemisphere gets hold of it, is literally represented, which means that it's present again after the fact when it is in fact no longer present. So its representations are not the real thing, but it's easy enough to conflate them and even mistake them. If you like to put it in a simple way, the left hemisphere has the map, the right hemisphere has the terrain that is mapped. And the left hemisphere, the hemisphere of theory, of a diagram, of a mechanism, whereas the right hemisphere is the hemisphere of what we actually experience in all its complexity. So these are important distinctions. That's all been very rushed and a bit abstract, but here are some entertaining pictures done by people who had one hemisphere at a time suppressed. On the left here, you see a tree drawn in the normal state. In the middle, you see the left hemisphere only tree. You can see that there's only one half of it there. That's hemi-neglect as described, but also how very inanimate and symbolic it has become. On the right, you see the right hemisphere only tree, which is, if anything, it's a perfectly understandable whole, and if anything, it seems more alive than the original both hemispheres tree. Here we have the same thing for flowers. So on the left, you see the flowers as in the normal state. These are from 3 different patients. And you see the left hemisphere only one is really a geometric, symmetrical model. And on the right, you see something that has the flow and structure of a living plant. Just here to show that perspective is lost in the left hemisphere, and it's perspective that gives us a sense of depth, i.e. not just a 2-dimensional screen or diagram, but actually the reality that you can walk off into. And here I just want to draw your attention to 2 columns. These are all people drawing with the left hemisphere only. You see the same geometric diagrams on the right, but look at the person in the next to last column. What has happened? A pair of rhomboids in one case, a stick person in another. And the other interesting column is the one on the far left, a cube, which shows it as a child would draw it. It knows there are 6 sides and they're all drawn, but that's in other words a conceptual cube, but not actually how it is experienced or seen. Gazzaniga and Ledoux have illustrations by patients drawing a cube with either hand perfectly well before an operation, but after the operation, the left hemisphere's hand, the right hand, is not able, or has been drawing cubes all its life, draws them flat. This is just, in my latest book, I include a lot of pictures by artists who've had strokes, which I think are very interesting. This is Otto Dix, a distinguished German painter. And on the top, you see a photograph and then two self-portraits done before his stroke. After a right hemisphere stroke, one notices several things. First of all, the profile, which is interesting because that is a tendency of the left hemisphere to have things shifted with the gaze towards the right. The cartoon nature of the representation, it's lost the depth of the idea of the personality in the earlier drawings. And another very interesting thing is the bottom right. You see that the hand that is drawing has obtruded into the drawing itself. There's been a conflation of the levels, which is something that postmodernism, like many right hemisphere deficit states, it celebrates. And the other interesting thing about it is that the hand has 6 fingers, and polydactyly and indeed supernumerary phantom limbs of all kinds are almost exclusively experienced after right hemisphere strokes. There's a lot more to say about that, and I wish I had time, and please don't despair that it all sounds very simple, because I'm compressing a great deal of information and simplifying it in the process. This is the book that came out a few months ago, my latest and I imagine last attempt to understand how this conundrum of the difference between the hemispheres influences our understanding of the world and of ourselves. It's about 1,500 pages in the 2 volumes, and it falls into 3 parts. It's part 1 that I want to refer to at the moment. Some scientists and philosophers surely have in common one thing, at least, which is a quest for truth. At least, what can we take to be truer than its alternatives? But if it's true that we experience 2 versions of the world that are not always reconcilable, which one is the one we should prefer? And what sort of a world or a universe follows from this? Who indeed, in Plotinus's words, are we? So in this book, as I say, in the first 400 pages, I review the vast body of evidence that we now have to support a much more sophisticated view of hemisphere difference and how to understand it. And in part 1, I examine what might be called the portals on reality, the meanness that each hemisphere has to bring to bear at the very first level to generate its experienced world. And I take these to be attention, which is extremely important in all its various ways, perception, which of course is not the same thing as attention, judgments formed on the basis of attention and perception, i.e. what we believe, apprehension, by which I specifically mean the affordances offered to utilization. Our understanding also depends on a few other things, such as our emotional and social intelligence, very much, on our cognitive intelligence, and to some extent on the bringing to bear of creativity in order to make sense of what it is we're seeing. And there's much evidence in these chapters that is, I think, humanly fascinating and scientifically informative, coming from the reports of cases in which one or other hemisphere was for some reason deficient. And to cut to the chase, so you now don't have to read these 400 pages, the conclusion in a nutshell, that is, in every case but one, the right hemisphere is demonstrably superior. In the normal state, it is more efficient, and if there is damage to the right hemisphere, it is more damaging than damage to the left hemisphere. This is true of attention, perception, judgment, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, which may surprise some people, and creativity. The one in which the left hemisphere is obviously indisputably more important is in apprehension. In other words, utilizing the world through 2 main aspects of our array of faculties, through language and through the use of the right hand. And those are the things that are noticeable after a stroke on the ward when somebody has a left-handed stroke. So these are the things we know about and are taught about. But the fact that the world has become completely incomprehensible and very much changed to the person who has a right hemisphere stroke has not been sufficiently realized, although it's amply recorded in a wonderful literature, often in French and German, and therefore not available to English-only speakers. I mentioned that IQ seems preponderantly important on the right on the right hemisphere, dependent on the right hemisphere, might surprise people. This is from Barbie et al. In 2014, in which they looked at 158 patients where they could compare pre-stroke IQ and post-stroke IQ. And as you can see, almost all the important areas for the drop in IQ are to be found in the right hemisphere. According to the normal convention of radiography, the left hemisphere is on the right and the right hemisphere is here on the left. I can only allude to what parts 2 and 3 contain. Part 2, I basically asked, so on the basis of that information that comes through the portals, what paths can we take towards truth? And I suggest that they are science, reason, intuition, and imagination, and that all of these are important, and wherever possible we should bring all of them to bear, or at least as many as we can, whereas often we are encouraged to bring only one or perhaps two to bear on the task. And in each case, this is also a very long part of the book, and there are several chapters on science, on reason, on intuition, and so on. The other thing I conclude is that in every case, including science and reason, the most important steps are taken by the right hemisphere. People assume it must be the left. And procedural things that are regular and calculative are better done by the left hemisphere. But seeing your way to the solution of a scientific or mathematical problem indisputably depends very largely on the right hemisphere. We know this both from observation and from the accounts of people who have made those discoveries. And in part 3, I consider how we might need to change the way we think of what might be thought of as the constituents of the cosmos, including time, space, flow, matter, consciousness, and what we're to make of the existences of values, purpose, and indeed the sense of the sacred. So back to part 1. The effects of the lesions, well, on the left hemisphere, they lead to compromise of our ability to manipulate the world using language in the right hand. And in the right hemisphere, they lead to an inability to understand the world. And we sometimes think that because we know how to intervene in the world and use it, that means we understand it. Because we have a mechanism, that means we understand what's going on. But this is the problem, the story of the sorcerer's apprentice. The sorcerer's apprentice overheard a spell and was able to cast the spell, but didn't understand what the consequences of casting the spell would be, or how to stop it or reverse it, which very soon became extremely important. What happens after right hemisphere stroke? Well, I think this picture by Hieronymus Bosch, called The Garden of Earthly Delights, tells you everything. Pandemonium, people with heads up their asses and growing beaks and all the rest. A really extraordinary distortion of reality. It's thought that Bosch actually experienced these hallucinations due to ergot poisoning, but we can't be sure about that. So I just want to go through some reality distortions that will be familiar to those of you who are psychiatrists or neuropsychologists. First of all, I just want to make a couple of observations about the laterality of reality distortions in general. There are 2 papers I want to allude to. One is Cuttings in 2011, which is the largest systematic study to date of the nature and lateralization of brain lesions giving rise to anomalous altered perceptions. And he concluded that there were, I can tell you 73%. Why has it stopped doing something for me? Let's try this again. 73% due to right hemisphere lesions, and to an almost simultaneous but completely independent comprehensive survey of the literature on lateralization and delusions, in other words, false beliefs of a kind. And they also found that 73% were due to right hemisphere lesions. But it's much more striking than that, because the numbers are made up by some very minor distortions, but the really severe distortions and the persistent distortions are almost always due to right hemisphere dysfunction. So here I'm going to go through things that are very largely, and in some cases almost entirely, occurrent after right hemisphere deficits, not after left. Delusional paranoia, of course one understands, hemi-neglect, which I've talked about. anosognosia, denying that there is a deficit, which I've again briefly described, this denial that there is anything wrong with you or that needs treatment or is not functional. Asymmetry, which is denial of a part of the body as belonging to you, not able to understand what this thing there is, but it's part of your own body. Anosodiaphoria, which is an inappropriate lack of sense of the importance or the gravity of what has happened after a trauma of some kind, which may have left one with enormous deficits. There is a kind of almost facetious refusal to take any of it seriously and to trivialize. In other words, a sort of shallow affect without any of the normal depth of connection. Then there is somatoparaphrenia, which is a belief that part of your body either belongs to someone else or has been turned into an inanimate object. These are very, very striking. I give case histories of many of these. Prosopagnosia, which is the inability to read a face, pretty central to human functioning. Delusional misidentification, which include Capgras and Frege syndrome. Capgras syndrome being when you believe that somebody you know very well has been replaced by a simulator who is pretending to be your wife, your husband, or whoever it might be. And Frege syndrome, which is the inverse, where you see in somebody that you don't know, somebody that you do know very well. But it goes beyond that. There are other kinds, but they are all almost exclusively due to right hemisphere dysfunction. And I do as best I can complete surveys of the literature on these things. Mirrored self-delusion, in which one doesn't understand one's own reflection in a mirror. Supernumerary phantom limbs, sometimes quite exotic, with 6 legs coming off the pelvis in various Kali-like ways. Cotard's delusion, in which one believes one is dead, and in some cases goes so far as to request burial. One believes one's a rotting corpse. Alice in Wonderland syndrome, an interesting but sometimes misapplied term, which strictly should refer to distortions of the sense of time and distortions of the body. So you remember Alice became very small, became very tall, and when she was running, she didn't seem to be going anywhere. When she was falling down the well, it seemed to take hours and hours to go, although she knew she wasn't really falling that far. Autoscopy, which is seeing yourself from outside or above. Misoplegia, which is taking a dislike to a limb that seems to be perfectly all right and hitting it, hating it, trying to disable it. And an even more exotic condition called xenomelia, in which people actually request surgical amputation of a perfectly functional limb. Then there are some distortions that are just more common, considerably more common after right than left, but not so very exclusively. And they are Othello syndrome, which is delusional jealousy, and de Clérambault syndrome, which is the play Misty for Me syndrome, in which you believe that public figures that are glamorous or powerful love you. And this can, of course, be very dangerous for the objects of this, who may end up being assaulted or killed. And then there is one that is neither, heotoscopy, which is similar to autoscopy, but where you see yourself at a distance. And then there is one condition which is very largely left hemisphere dependent, and that is autotopagnosia, which is not being able to name on command a certain body part. And that obviously may connect with the naming faculty, which is one of the things we know is disturbed in left hemisphere damage anyway. So what you can deduce from that, you can see, is that it is very, very largely the right hemisphere that anchors us in reality. And when it goes, the left hemisphere is completely adrift to know what is going on or understand the world. It can still speak after a fashion, and it can still use its right hand, but it has lost this very important part of being alive. So delusions, as Oren Davinsky says, result from right hemisphere lesions, but it is the left hemisphere that is deluded. Here a quote from Nikki Marinsek, and the italics are her own. Only patients with right hemisphere brain damage continue to overestimate their ability to perform a task after they had just failed to perform the task in question. And then one from the great and missed Yark Panksepp, the left hemisphere even chooses to confabulate. It's not as though it has to, but it's almost like a pathological liar in this respect, that it almost prefers at times to confabulate. Now, why is this important? Well, as Whitehead said, as we think, we live, something that is worth reflecting on. And that's what I deal with in this book. And I want to just make some last reflections on the world that we now find ourselves in. We now find ourselves, I believe, in a world where most of the things that we would want to rely on have gone missing. We live in a world which is more like the map than a territory. And we live in a world in which we are at one remove. It's the piece of paper with the tick on it that matters more than what actually happened. It's the sign that matters what is signified. And so we live in a world in which signs signal impotently and pointlessly only to themselves. And this reminds me of a story by Yuri Tininov, published in Russia in 1927, called Lieutenant Kizia, in which he describes a person who was created by a mistranscription of a list of soldiers in the Tsarist army, and once in existence on the piece of paper, actually had an existence in life. He was found to be a very dependable comrade. He was decorated for bravery. He married, had children, and finally was promoted by the Tsar to a decorated general. When the Tsar actually wanted to meet this person, he couldn't be found anywhere. And so in despair, he ordered a state funeral for this great man. Meanwhile, a Lieutenant Sinyukhaev, who'd been left off the list, was wandering the streets and roads of Russia with very little success, trying to impress on people that despite what it said on the piece of paper, he was really still alive. So if I were right that the left hemisphere had taken over and ruled out, as it were, the perceptions that we can get from the right hemisphere, let's do a thought experiment. What would the world look like? I think it would look a bit like this. There'd be loss of the broader picture at the expense of details. Knowledge would be replaced by information, tokens, or representations, and there'd be the loss of concepts of skill and judgment which can't be reduced to following rules, and wisdom would be right out because that's the product of experience in a long life and far too difficult to objectify and measure according to some scale that a manager somewhere wants to have measured. Things would become simultaneously more abstract and yet more reified. So matter would become simply lumpen matter, which had no other aspect to it. And the things that we used to think of as living and embodied become purely abstract. So the importantly amphibious nature of living creatures, including ourselves, would be divaricated in this way. Bureaucracy would have a field day, according to Peter Berger, many of its famous sociologists, many of its important elements are procedures that are known, anonymity, organizability, predictability, explicit abstraction, and loss of the sense of uniqueness, which would be swallowed up in a category. And whenever I'm asked to fill out one of these forms, there is never a box to tick for my own answer, which is, well, on which day and with whom and about what. So all those things get lost. Quantity becomes the only criterion. We live in a world in which it is either or, black or white. Finessed judgments, matters of implicit meaning get lost out. Reasonableness is replaced by rationality, by which I mean there is something such that you can be irrationally rational. There are areas in which you can take pure rationality, which are utterly not only unreasonable, but irrational. I'm making a distinction there between what in other languages, such as German, they have different words for. What I'm describing here is the difference between verstehen, reasonableness, and Verstand, Vernunft, which is reasonableness, and Verstand, which is rationality. There's also would be a failure of that now very uncommon thing, common sense, which is actually a very complex faculty. Systems designed to maximize utility only. There'll be a loss of social cohesion, and there'll be consequent fragmentation of groups who would be at war with one another. There'll be a relative sense of depersonalization. Paranoia would govern our interactions, and lack of trust. We'd have to be monitored on screens. We'd have to have DNA sampling and so forth in order to be sure where we are, tracked by mobile phones. In other words, there'd be need for total control. The left hemisphere's raison d'etre is control, manipulation, power. That is its one value. Anger and aggression would become because anger actually, curiously, is the most lateralized of all emotions. And guess what? It doesn't lateralize to the right, it lateralizes to the left. And this would become the keynote of our interactions. We would at the same time see ourselves as the passive victims of other people's doings. For example, if something I have doesn't work, it's nothing to do with me, it's to do with that man over there. At the same time, art would become purely conceptual with a lack of the sense of depth, which is underwritten by the right hemisphere. There'd be distorted or bizarre perspectives. Music would be reduced to little more than rhythm, since harmony and melody are very importantly subtended by the right hemisphere and rhythm alone by the left hemisphere in most people. And it's not true of professional musicians who have diversified their brains, but for most of us, that's the way it is. And even complex or syncopated rhythms are better understood by the right hemisphere. And language would become diffuse and excessive, I hope not too much like mine, lacking in concrete reference. There'll be a deliberate undercutting of the sense of awe or wonder. The left hemisphere is rather impatient with this idea. It just means we haven't done enough experiments on it. We know the answer to all these questions, potentially, and in a couple of years we'll have them. When that happened to physics at the end of the 19th century, almost immediately there were discoveries which showed that everything they thought they knew about physics was largely mistaken. Flow would become reduced to just the sum of an infinite series of pieces. There'll be discarding of all tacit forms of knowing, which are extraordinarily important. We'd be strangled by a network of small, explicit, complicated rules. That phrase comes from 19th century French visitor to America, the name will come to me in a minute. So he was seeing that in the 1830s, and we'd be priding ourselves on being, as Descartes thought, spectators rather than actors in this world. And all this would be accompanied by a dangerously unwarranted optimism. Well, thank God we don't live in that world.
Okay, thank you, Iain. We had a late start due to some small technical issues, which fortunately we managed to get through. So unfortunately, we don't really have much time for questions, but let's have a quick look.
By the way, the person I couldn't remember the name of was, of course, de Tocqueville.
Yeah. There's a few questions here, Iain, if you want to have a quick look, and we might have a time to answer them.
I haven't really time to read all this in detail. Somebody asked me about psychedelics, and the short answer to that is I don't particularly focus on that. Somebody asked me about right-left differences in mania and depression, mania left predominant and depression right predominant, and I do definitely deal with that and would largely agree with that in both books, actually. Somebody asked me, can I elucidate why I feel left is certain and abstraction and all the right is open to possibility, but contextual and unique? And the answer to that, I'm afraid, is that you will have to read the book, because I've not attempted to give any reasoning, any data. If I did, this would have had to last 2 days rather than 45 minutes. So, but it is all there, I do promise you, and you're willing to, if you're willing to read it and take issue with it, if you like. The left hemisphere sounds at times autistic. I do think that laterality plays a part in autism spectrum disorder, but I think autism is complex. I don't think there's one autism. I think there are more likely autisms, and some of them seem to be very predominantly left lateralized, in which people don't understand implicit meaning. They only understand explicit verbalizations, can't read body language, and so on. But there are others like Temple Grandin, who think entirely in pictures, and was amazed to hear that some people thought in words. So I think in short, that the problem is going to turn out to be something in the corpus callosum that may deliver one or other of these aspects. Thoughts on alpha symmetry. There are some of these, particularly in one of the appendixes to the first volume, but it's an enormously complex topic, and I probably haven't got time to go there, but it's in, I think, Appendix 1 in Volume 1 of my new book. And can I comment on sex differences? In brief, I can, and I think there are two levels. There's a phenomenological view of it, in which one might well think that the right hemisphere was more like the world that maybe is brought into being by the female mind, and there are certainly parallels with that. And certainly when one sees people who are extremely left hemisphere dominated, in the sense that they are nerds, they may be male. But unfortunately, all the neurological evidence is staggering, that where men and women differ, and one uses the left hemisphere and the other uses the right, it is almost in every single case the woman who uses the left hemisphere while the man uses the right. I go through all this in some detail in a few pages in volume 1. What is, I think interesting is that, and by the way, it's testosterone that causes expansion of the right hemisphere in males in the second trimester in utero. And although the right hemisphere is bigger than the left, generally, I generally say that, this is very largely due to the effect of males, in which the right hemisphere is very clearly somewhat bigger than the left. But I think there's another level on which to think, and I think that the questioner may be alluding to that. And I think that it's important to see that, yes, many aspects of what I'm pointing to has been neglected in a largely male-dominated culture. So I agree with that. I wish I could go into detail with these answers, but I can't really now.
Well, there is a possibility. Dr. McGilchrist will be here tomorrow. If anyone wishes to meet him, I suggest you send me an email and I'll see if I can get you into his schedule. But we're out of time now, so I'll thank you once again, Iain.
Thank you.
And sorry that we can't do this in person. That's what I
It's
really
a huge shame, but there we are.
It is a shame, but never mind.
There we are. Next time.
Next time. We can do the second book, or by then maybe the third. Okay. All right, everybody, thank you very much. We'll call it a day then.